All right. Okay. Good evening, everybody, and welcome to our educational segment of the TAPPPS Group. And TAPPPS is a group in Texas, and we formed this group with a goal to bring back competitive marketplace in the cattle industry, so cattle producers can actually make a decent living again, and so the consumers may purchase our product at a fair price with the knowledge that they're getting American born, raised, and harvested beef. And that's our goal. And really, it's no easy task to accomplish this mission. We have to fight a corrupt corporate system that's exploiting the consumers and squeezing the producers out of business. So we're here to protect our industry, and we're going to fight for it. And our mission is to make the industry fair and bring back a competitive market. And we brought together a group of real, what I call experts. These folks know the industry inside and out. And what we're wanting to do at this time is to try to educate the general public, the consumer, in what's going on in our industry, because they're going to be paramount in us getting our goal accomplished, because we are going to try to introduce legislation to the Congress and Senate in January. And with the cattle producer being less than 0.5% of the population, the cattle producers ourselves are not going to be able to push us through. We need the general public, the people that buy the beef, to actually understand what's going on in the industry and to know enough about our legislation, just the basics about our legislation, to where they can actually have a conversation with their elected officials about what's going on and demand that they look at our cause and get behind our movement. I'm going to turn it over to Angie. She's our communications director, and we'll get started.
Hello, everybody. I'd like to welcome you to our call tonight. Chuck just gave you like a recap there of what we're about and what we're doing. Tonight, as he said, we have a great lineup of subject matter experts. And I would ask you to get a pen and paper handy, because I'm sure that they're going to incite some questions that you're going to want to write down to ask at the end of the call tonight. I will ask that you mute your mics while we're on the call. And if you have a question, I believe there's a raise your hand feature that you can use that we can see, and you can ask the question. And I'll introduce myself first, and then as each speaker speaks, they're going to introduce themselves and tell you where they're from. And I'm from just north of Springfield, Missouri, and my husband and I are cow-calf producers and have been for many, many years. So we're fighting hard for the cow-calf people. And I think we'll get started with Bill tonight.
Thank you, Angie. I'm Bill Bullard, and I am here with R-Calf USA. And what I'd like to do this evening is explain in a visual way the very radical changes that have occurred in the U.S. cattle industry over the course of just over a generation, 35 to 40 years. There's been literally radical changes to the structure of the industry. And I want to point out how that affects consumers on one end of the supply chain and producers on the other. So is the graph up?
Yes.
Okay. So I'd like to show you a chart that's populated with 32 years of monthly data. The blue graph represents, at the top of the graph, represents the retail price that consumers pay for beef in the grocery store over 32 years. The red line represents the value of fed cattle, the cattle that are used to produce the beef that consumers purchase at the grocery store. So you can see, beginning in 1990, 32 some years ago, 3 decades ago, we had a relationship between the value of cattle and the price that consumers pay for beef. And as consumer demand for beef had increased and their willingness to pay more, you see that cattle prices have followed. So you could say there's been a synchronous relationship for about 2 decades, and it goes long further back than 1990. But there's always been a synchronous relationship between the retail price of beef that consumers purchase and the price that America's cattle farmers and ranchers receive in the marketplace for their cattle. And so this synchronous relationship has gone on. And you can see that as retail beef prices began to increase significantly back in the late 2010s, and you see that cattle prices followed until we hit about the early 2015. And in 2015, cattle prices inexplicably collapsed. And they collapsed further and faster than at any time in history. And they collapsed for nearly a 2-year period. But you can see retail beef prices that consumers continued to purchase in the grocery store continued to increase. But as prices for cattle hit bottom in late 2016, cattle prices tried to recover and retail prices started to march skyward. And so we had upward trending retail prices from 2017 through present. And we've had cattle prices stair-stepping downward. And every time they try to rally, they'd collapse again. And they try to rally again, but could never reach the earlier price peak that they had achieved. And they continued to collapse. And we just see those prices stair-stepping downward. And so what has happened over the past 8 years since 2015 is unprecedented. We've never seen a spread between that we've seen for 8 years, where retail beef prices are super inflated and cattle prices continue to struggle to the point where cattle producers are having extreme difficulty even recovering their cost of production in the marketplace. So what we can see and visualize from this chart is that there is now a complete and utter disconnect between the price of beef that consumers pay at the grocery store and the price that cattle producers receive for their cattle. And that is odd. It's odd because the only ingredient in beef is cattle. And yet we see this complete disconnect that has occurred in the industry. So we have to look at, well, what structurally changed within the industry to allow this disconnect to occur over the past 8 years. And what I'm showing you now are 2 pie charts, and they represent the consumer dollar that consumers pay at the grocery store for beef. And if we go back to a little over a generation, we go back to 1980, at that time, you could see the lion's share of the blue graph was the share of the consumer dollar that flowed back to the American cattle farmer and rancher. They were receiving over 60 cents of every dollar consumers spent on beef. And back then in 1980, the retailers and the packers were sharing the minority share of less than 40 cents for every dollar. Well, jump ahead today, just a little over a generation later, in 2021, we see a complete reversal. Now it is the packer and the retailer that is capturing over 60 cents of every dollar that consumers spend on beef, and the entire live cattle supply chain is now sharing less than 40 cents. Now, this is a radical structural change in the industry. The allocation that a competitive market should be making when a consumer purchases a retail product at the grocery store, the competition and competitive market forces should be allocating to each segment of the supply chain their competitive share of that consumer beef dollar. But it's been tipped on its head. And so as a result of this, what we've seen in the industry is a drastic decline in the number of American cattle farmers and ranchers. We go back to just over a generation, we had about 1.3 million cattle producing operations scattered all across the United States. And we saw cattle producer numbers begin to falter in the mid 1980s. And then our government came up with a solution. The solution, they said, had to be not government interference in the marketplace at all. The solution would be simply to build more demand for beef and expand export markets. So we embarked on a grand experiment in the early 90s. We entered the North American Free Trade Agreement, and the promise back to the consumers and producers would be that we would increase demand for beef, we would increase market share abroad for US cattle producers. That would create and bring about prosperity for cattle producers. And because there would be more total available beef, consumers would be paying lower prices for beef at the grocery store. That was in 1994. Since then, the number of US cattle farmers and ranchers have continued to decline. And in fact, over this 35-year period, the average loss per year of our American cattle farmers and ranchers was about 15,000 per year for this entire time period. Now, there's a gap in this chart, and that's the result of the USDA no longer providing annual data as to the number of beef cattle operations remaining in the United States. So now we have to rely on the census, and the census only occurs every 5 years. So we know as a result of the disconnect and the minimal share that's now flowing to cattle producers, we've lost a lot more cattle producers just since the latest data here at 2017. And I'm afraid to even venture a guess how many cattle producers we've lost from the industry. But as you can see, as a result of these radical changes that have occurred throughout our industry, structural changes, we are losing the American cattle producers. Now, from a consumer perspective, what that means is we are concentrating and centralizing both the production of beef and the products of cattle and the subsequent processing of beef at meat packers. And so this puts consumers in a vulnerable position. They could again see shortages in the grocery stores, inability for the supply chain, to reach critical areas where beef supplies may be short. And so the risk to consumers is the inability to avail themselves of the #1 protein source in America, and that's the U.S. beef produced by U.S. cattle producers. So now we want to look at, well, where are we likely to go if no changes are made? And so I'm showing you a sister industry. I'm showing you data from the sheep industry, which was a viable commercial industry in the United States for decades. And this chart goes back for the same period, back to 1980, a little over a decade ago. Now, the red line on this chart represents consumer consumption of lamb here domestically in the US. So this is consumer consumption on an annual basis for some 35 years. And the light blue graph that followed consumption, as consumption increased, so too did sheep production in the United States. And you can see that the blue graph would follow America's appetite for lamb up until about the mid-90s. And then from the mid-90s, we see that consumer consumption remained relatively stable. It was somewhat volatile, but it was almost a flat line if you did drew a line across the data points. But you could see that sheep production began to decline significantly. And now the maroon graph below the domestic production, that represents the imports of lamb, primarily from Australia and New Zealand. And so you can see that in the mid-90s, as domestic production began to fall, imports of lamb began to increase significantly. In fact, I said that backwards. As the imports of lamb began to increase significantly, domestic production began to collapse. And the reason for that was the lamb was brought in undifferentiated. Consumers didn't know if it was American lamb, New Zealand lamb, or Australian lamb. And these lambs from abroad were brought in here much cheaper than what the US cattle producer could produce the same quality of animal for, simply because of the more stringent health and safety standards that we have in the United States, the more stringent environmental standards, the greater commitment to ensure that workers received a fair price. So we saw that occur beginning in the mid-90s, but then in the early and mid-2000s, something happened. In the early to mid-2000s, we saw that imports actually increased above the level of domestic production in the United States. So in 2006, for example, was the point at which the US lamb consumer began to depend more on imports than they did on domestic production. And then you can see consumer consumption dropped in the 2010 timeframe. And then consumer consumption began to increase significantly. And look who's taken advantage of that increased American consumption of lamb. It's not the domestic sheep producer. We've literally destroyed the commercial sheep industry in the United States. Now, the lion's share, over 60% of all the lamb and mutton consumed in the United States, is derived from foreign countries. And so what this graph shows us is where the US cattle industry is heading as a result of the radical structural changes that have occurred if significant reforms are not instituted. And we go back to the North American Free Trade Agreement experiment. What happened there was consumers have been increasingly paying more for beef. They were promised lower prices and a more abundant supply of beef. And we see that the domestic cattle producer continued to decline in numbers. And as the initial graph showed, suddenly we woke up and saw this complete disconnect between consumer prices and prices that cattle producers receive. So what's happened in the industry is a result of concentration in the industry. Back in 1980, we had 4 of the largest beef packers, and they were all American-based companies, but they controlled 36% of the marketplace. And I said earlier, we had 1.3 million cattle producers, and they had hundreds or over 100,000 marketing outlets with which to sell their cattle. We had over 113,000 independent family-sized cattle feedlots, relatively small feedlots that were owned and operated by family farmers and ranchers, many of which raised their own corn, and they marketed their corn to the cattle. So we had 113,000 of those. And we were slaughtering about 32 million head of cattle 40 years ago. And we had about just under 1,500 federally inspected beef packing plants that would process those cattle. So back then we had many sellers of cattle and we had many buyers of cattle and many processors, and consumers were receiving or were paying a competitive price for beef in the marketplace. We jump to today. We've wiped out over 500,000 beef cattle operations during that period. We've wiped out 75% of the marketing outlets. We've reduced the number of independent family-sized farmer feeders by 75%. The 4 packers now control 85% of the fed cattle market, and 2 of those 4 packers are now Brazilian-owned companies. They're no longer even American companies. So we have fast, centralized, and concentrated this industry and developed a bottleneck in the system. And you recognize that. The consumers, when they went to the grocery store in early 2020, and for the first time in history, they could not buy the protein that they needed for their family because the shelves were empty. Well, the shelves were empty because we have begun to dismantle the competitive infrastructure for the US cattle industry. And again, the solution, the only solution offered was enter a free trade agreement, expand beef, the potential for US cattle producers to have more markets abroad, build beef demand, and that was to be the salvation for the cattle industry. So we've entered many free trade agreements. And as a result, our industry is now awash in a huge trade deficit that averages about $1 billion or 1 billion pounds of beef a year is what we the difference between what we export and what we import. We are a net importer. We import far more than what we export. And as a result, we put downward pressure on cattle prices, and we give the concentrated meat packers the ability to exploit consumers and producers. And they have done so in a remarkable fashion. And one of the means that they have achieved that is by non-disclosure of the origins of beef that consumers buy at the grocery store. You know, you can go to the grocery store and see a label that says product of the USA. That doesn't mean that was produced by the American cattle farmer or rancher. It simply means that it may have been brought in from Uruguay, labeled as a product of Uruguay, brought to a US beef packing plant. There at the plant, they would take it out of the imported package, throw the Uruguayan label in the garbage, and then affix a product of the USA label on it, because in its infinite wisdom, our government says that once a product goes through even minimal processing, it's deemed to be a domestic product. So the product of USA label at your grocery store is absolutely meaningless. It provides no information to consumers as to the true origins of beef. So that beef could be coming from Nicaragua, Costa Rica, Honduras, Argentina, Uruguay, Brazil, New Zealand, Australia, or any one of the 20 countries that we are importing increasing volumes of beef from every single year and every month. And so the meat packers have begun to exploit this free trade solution that actually benefits them at the expense of both consumers and producers. And then the meat packers began to introduce new cattle procurement tools, new means by which they could extract cattle from US cattle producers that did not involve competition. They began to shun and avoid the competitive cash market. And instead, they were forcing producers to enter contracts, future or forward contracts that didn't even disclose the price, that the base price of the animal that the cattle feeder would be receiving months in advance when they, or months into the future when they ultimately deliver the cattle to the packer. So that's just one example of tools that the packers use. Another tool that they use, which we call the instruments by which they exploit the marketplace, is they began to buy feedlots and buy cattle. And so they would compete with America's cattle farmers and ranchers in order to put cattle into a feedlot. And then they would turn around and be the only buyer for the same cattle and farmer and rancher that they competed with in order to purchase the cattle. So what we're seeing today is that these largest of feedlots are closely aligned with the meat packers. They're able to pay far more for lighter weight cattle to feed them to finishing weight to the packer. And as a result, independent feeders can't pencil out a profit because there has been a lack of profitability in the industry for 20 years. And in fact, for the past, since 2017, the returns, the average monthly returns to US cattle producers who feed cattle and sell to packers has been a negative $60 per head per month for the past 5 years. A negative $60 per head per month has been lost by US cattle producers for the last 5 years. That explains why we've lost 75% of the industry. Doesn't explain why the mega feedlots continue to expand their pens. So with that introduction and hopefully explanation as to how serious this crisis is, where this industry is headed if we make no significant changes, and the negative impacts that it has on the consuming public because of the potential for shortages of beef and the very real ongoing situation where consumers are paying super inflated prices for beef while cattle producers receive depressed prices for cattle. And so that's where the TAPPPS Group and the hard work that they put together in putting together legislation, draft legislation to bring to Congress. The draft legislation provides the needed reforms to reverse this train wreck. And it includes, number one, for American consumers to inform consumers as to the country of origin of beef at the grocery store with a mandatory country of origin label. It then begins to reform these instruments of leverage that the packers have used in the marketplace by banning packers from owning and controlling and feeding cattle for more than 7 days before those animals are ready to harvest. And this legislation would ban these anti-competitive contracts where the packers are extracting cattle from cattle producers without even negotiating a price for the animals, and the animals are subsequently delivered months down the road. This legislation addresses the need for more packing plants. I said earlier, we've lost over half of all the federally inspected plants. The AMP Act, the Agricultural and Marketing Production Act, will incentivize the building and construction and expansion of packer capacity. So there are more local and regional packing plants available to consumers so they don't have to rely on a packing plant that may be 800 to 1,300 miles away from their home in order to obtain their beef. And then the AMP Act also addresses the issue of foreign ownership of our critical production sectors, like the Brazilians owning, or half of our 4 largest packers are Brazilian owned, owning and controlling the production of beef processing in the United States. And so the AMP Act could be viewed as a comprehensive reform measure, otherwise known as an omnibus bill to address the critical prices that the cattle industry is facing and that the consumers are currently reeling from. So I will stop there, and at the end would be happy to answer any questions. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Bill. I believe we have Brett Kinsey up next.
All right, thanks, Angie. Yeah, I'm Brett Kinsey. I'm a cow-calf producer, feedlot operator from South Central South Dakota. I'm also the president of RCAF USA. Bill, can you put that first graph back up? I hate to do that to you short notice. I don't know if that's possible or not. There we go. Let's take that graph and let's look at it and let's personalize it a little bit. You know, as we go along, we have milestones in our lives, right? MCOOL was technically voted into law, if I'm correct, in May of 2002, or in 2002 anyway. But then through political shenanigans back and forth, it went along, it was unfunded, it was challenged, but really MCOOL was implemented with teeth, I believe, around 12 or 13, 2012 or 13. And I remember that because that's about the time that my dad died. I remember him saying, you know, he had a protracted illness, but he never lost his sense of humor. He said, you know, I think things are really going to get good for you boys, or everybody with common sense is already dead. Because the market, as you look at it, you almost couldn't lose. If you kept the boat loaded, as cattlemen call it, if you kept inventory, you just kept making money. And then when MCOOL was fully implemented in 14 and 15, and granted we were in a drought, but we were able to benefit from the consumer choosing real American beef, and cattle prices were tremendous. And at that moment, I believe we were receiving about 52 to 55% of the consumer's dollar. You know, I mean, I really want to thank the TAPPPS Group for the opportunity to be here. And I really hope that we get this to some consumers. And it's important to note that when MCOOL was repealed, all the economists were saying exactly the same thing that they are right now to cattle producers. Oh, you've lost your neighbors to drought, but this thing is really going to get good. You can't lose. It's going to get good. It's going to stay good. Get in there. You've got 2 or 3 more years before they can rebuild the herd. I believe that Cattle Facts said that in 2014. Well, look at what happened when MCOOL was repealed. That market, if you can imagine being a kid sitting on the sled at the peak of that red peak and riding that down, those were dollars flying out of our pockets. And if you didn't put some away when things were good, and the only reason I'm still sitting here is because we did, thankfully, because we were unsure of ourselves as younger operators whose dad just died, right? So it was kind of divine intervention. That thing, I remember sitting in the sale barn losing $600 a head. We had 240 head there. And you just kind of sat up straight and took it. But okay, Bill, you can take that down. So that's the, oh, wait, one more thing. It's important. I'm not an economist. I went to college. I have a bachelor's degree, but I remember in economics class, if you look at the blue line, that's what a consumer is willing to pay for beef based on quality, their income, a million different things. And what they pay when it mirrors itself as you're going up and down like that, that's what informs producers on how much to produce. When the consumer will pay more, the producer sees that and he will produce more. If consumer prices go down due to whatever reasons, then that sends a signal to cattlemen that maybe it's time to liquidate. And that's, I don't know if that's solid economic theory or not, but you can see after 2014 how those signals completely divorce themselves. What you as a consumer were willing to pay for beef has almost nothing to do with what we're paid as cattlemen to produce the cattle that make the beef. And so it just breaks it wide open. And I call that blue field between the red line and the peak of what the consumer is paying. That is the playground of corporate power right there. So, okay, Bill, that's what I wanted to say on that. I guess I'm just trying to personalize this a little bit. And this is a political story, but not a partisan story. I believe it was 2020, President Trump went to Mount Rushmore to speak. And it was a big, big deal because we hadn't had fireworks out at Mount Rushmore for years. They flew in dignitaries, and some friends and I got to talking, and we decided that to push MCOOL, because President Trump ran on antitrust, he ran on Make America Great Again, he ran on Made in the USA, Buy American, and we were excited. I mean, we were so excited. It was such a new message that we hadn't heard, but we were having a hard time getting the administration's attention in terms of MCOOL so that we could compete on the world stage, and especially in America with American beef. So some friends and I, we loaded up and we took some grills and some home-raised hamburger, and we lined up a small part of a parking lot at Keystone. It's a little town adjacent to Mount Rushmore, and we fed the cops hamburgers. The cops and really anybody else, consumers. And Shad Sullivan had made a banner 6 foot tall by 30 foot wide that said USA Beef. And we were set up adjacent to the highway, so the traffic going up and down to go see Trump and everybody at Mount Rushmore, they'd go by and they'd honk. And, you know, people just love, we're just patriotic people, right? We love our country. And, you know, we were there with basically two missions: to try to get the attention of the media and Trump, but then also to just talk to consumers, because there were people there from all over the country. And when you told them about the repeal of MCOOL and how the meat that they're buying that has a product of the USA label on it might not be true, they thought we were crazy. But as we had conversations with them, they really got fired up. And I guess that's what we're trying to do again now, is just let people know that we're not looking for subsidies or handouts or even legs up. We just want a level field to compete. And that's what MCOOL would do. It would allow us to compete with these rising imports. We did get one politician to stop. We were there and we were visiting with some people, and a black Suburban pulled up in a hurry and screeched to a stop, and it kind of alarmed us. And a young lady jumped out in a short skirt and high heels, dressed to the nines, and she came clacking over in her heels, stuck her hand out and said, "I'm Lauren Boebert. I'm running for Congress in Colorado, and I just love what you guys are doing here. I completely support you." And to be honest, at that time, we didn't think a lot about it, but lo and behold, she went up and sat with Trump, and she ended up getting elected. And now, as we're trying to get co-signers on the American Beef Labeling Act, she has yet to sign on. So why is that? And I would say it's corporate power. It's the global elites that run these corporations that have undue influence over Washington, D.C. You get almost any of these politicians out here in the country, and they'll pay you lip service, but their excuses, you know, are that the World Trade Organization will level tariffs. Well, that ruling was a long time ago. I'm not even sure that ruling would stand, where Canada and Mexico,
it's about that bank
basically
account.
won the right to force tariffs on us. And that's why our Congress folded and repealed MCOOL. The other one is that we can't expect to export beef if we don't import. And I guess it's really important for the consumer and producers to know that there's so much profit and via profit power to be gained in the sorting of imported beef and exported beef, and choosing what label you decide to put on it, whether accurate or inaccurate. It's no accident. It's no accident that we're the last independent segment of livestock, because we live independent, we're self-reliant, we're hard workers, so we've been holding on. But it's also no accident that we are under attack right now. Absolutely under attack, whether it's environmental, this crazy MCOOL law that's almost beyond belief. There's a lot of money in the beef industry, and they're coming for it. They want it all. So I guess I would just appreciate everybody getting behind this AMP Act, getting behind the American Beef Labeling Act. Whether you're for cool or against MCOOL, people know what MCOOL is. So we really need to make some noise. And I guess the cattlemen, you know, we've had a lot of positive talk. We had a Republican administration when I was out at Mount Rushmore. Now we've moved to a Democrat administration. The Democrats controlled it all. They said, yes, we're going to get this done. Now we're going into another midterm election, and we're just going to have to realize that it's not all about money. It's about power. It's about the right to choose. It's about sovereignty. It's about freedom. And we can't wait for another election or for another person or this or that. We have to figure out a way to be effective with whoever's in there when we have the right idea and it's good for America. I guess that's what I've got. Thank you.
Thank you, Brett. Mike Schultz?
Okay, yeah, is everybody having trouble following this deal? Because it seems like it's cutting in and out a little bit on me.
You sound good.
Okay, all right. Yeah, Mike Schultz, I'm from Northwest Kansas. I'm a cow-calf producer. We feed a few cattle. Been in the industry for a lot of years, probably well over 45. I want to go through tonight a little bit about, as the RCAF chairman for country of origin labeling, the economic impact by losing MCOOL and what it means to the rural communities across the country. And you as consumers, if you're consumers here tonight listening, I'm going to try to share this. I don't have a real good chart. I'll try to share it, Angie, if we can, later on with everybody if they want to see it. What it is it talks about all cattle and calf sales in the United States. Cash receipts in 2012 reached the point of a little over $66 billion. In 2013, it was $67,849,000,000. In 2014, during the full implementation of MCOOL, we reached a high of over $81 billion. And so in 15, it ended up being a little over 78 billion. And why I'm telling you that is the chart tonight that Bill showed you earlier and that Brett called up with that blue line and the red line for the feeder cattle market. That spread there from 2014 until today, they claim it's roughly over about $20 billion. And that's a fair amount of money. So this is going to be kind of quick, but if you realize that we slaughter about 34 million head of cattle a year, on an average since 2014, we have lost approximately $1,000 a head on the sale price for the cattle producer to what basically we received back in 2014. And December 22nd of 2014 is a date specific for me because that was the day I sold my calves. So the $20 billion is economic power. It's not held now in the hands of the people. It's held in the hands of the four packers that Bill talked about. MCOOL is very important. Why was it killed? The WTO ruling. RCAF, we have fully addressed the WTO ruling to try to reestablish MCOOL to be in compliance with what the WTO claimed was causing problems. I will tell you all that during MCOOL, the Canadians as well as the Mexican market mirrored the United States cattle market in 2014 and 15. They went up as our prices went up because the United States is a price setter. And so once our market went up, they have no competition in those countries either. Their market followed. When they defeated COOL, they were the two countries that chose to go against it. They ended up losing in the cattle market as well. So their markets today are down just like ours were. I would like to tell you that in the 1930 Tariff Act was to produce imported products into the United States were to carry a label to the last user. Isn't it strange that basically beef and dairy are some of the few that were exempted? The beef market is one of them that it doesn't make any sense at all why they chose to remove labeling to the last end user. Canada labels their beef. If those of you that don't understand what we're fighting, the Canadians have a maple leaf program. They still label their beef. The United States labels beef that is exported. We cannot allow labeling on our beef currently sold in the domestic market. It's insane to me why that doesn't happen. So we have to address that. I want to go over a couple other things so that you can kind of see where we're going. I mentioned at the RCAF convention, I was talking about the impact of the Brazilian JBS and Marfrig corporations. They were funded by the Brazilian government. They've all had problems with corruption. And I don't know if anybody's aware, but the United States currently, we have roughly about 91 million head of total cattle, about 34 million cows, mother cows, kind of an estimated number. And I want to tell you that the Brazilian cow herd is estimated at over 252 million head of cattle. And they just came out with an article here a few months ago, which I talked about during the RCAF convention when I gave my presentation. They expect to increase their cow herd number by 24 million head by 2030 because they believe there's a market for that. Now understand that. That's 24 million head in another 8 years. It's crazy that we're going to allow that. It's definitely going to be an impact on the market. And the Brazilian cattle market a few months ago was around 70 cents. So you can understand why they want to import cattle from Brazil to the United States and then sell it in the best domestic market in the world. And so I want to try to make people aware of that. The problem we have as cattle producers, as Bill talked about, I believe two big things that really would make a difference, and we could do especially both of these overnight, is MCOOL and the ban on packer ownership, feeding or control. You could actually do that January the 1st of 2023 and eliminate that and force those people to be back in the cash market, which would be an excellent opportunity for everybody who participates. It creates competition, and that's what it's all about. And why I bring that up is if people don't understand what's going on, I just had a scenario happen to me today that was kind of unique, so I'm going to lead into it. The Washington State issue here probably a year ago, if anybody does any research on the cattle market, there was a company by the name of Easterday who were buying cattle for Tyson. They ended up not having the cattle. They were getting paid for cattle that didn't exist. And then Tyson came to look at their cattle and they were gone. They didn't have cattle. So it was a big deal. But the point is that the Easterday buyer was at the auction bidding against guys like the Brett Kinseys, the independent cattle feeder, when he didn't have a sweetheart deal, because Easterday, he got to bill out whatever he paid for cattle. That's what he got paid for by Tyson through alternative sources, which really corrupted the market. And it really impacted the small independent cattle feeders who are trying to compete at the same time. So by telling you that, if you look at this case today, it happens in other industries. I was made aware today that there was a plumbing issue where there were people that were buying plumbing parts and they were out trying to sell them on a commission. And he was told, you can even pay under what our price is quoted by 30% because we get a bonus at the end of the year. So the bonuses that Bill talked about earlier happen in other industries. And so I talked to an attorney about this today. This is something that goes on when you're trying to compete in a competitive market. So these contract issue deals, they really need to be addressed. And that's why I believe the AMP Act, this TAPPPS group, has a good step forward in trying to address some of the corruption that's gone on that we can now share with other people. When Bill talked about we slaughtered around 34 million head of cattle, if you guys do the math at $1,000 a head, that's about $34 billion we're losing, not the 20 billion I just tried to explain to you in the cattle and cash cattle sales in the United States. So 34 billion is probably a more realistic number. And so you remember when you go downtown to your store, that money's not coming back in your local community. You're not going to generate any tax revenue. The tire shop's going to see it. The retail stores are going to see it. So it's a big deal as to why we've got to reinstate COOL and pass the ban on packer ownership. I think when we close out, I try to tell people this, you know, they talk about export sales all the time, and imports are very seldom mentioned. I mean, Brett touched on it a while ago. They told the cattle producers here recently that, boy, you're going to see 4 years of good prices again. But nobody ever talks about the effects of imports. But I'll tell you this, anybody in agriculture, whether you're a grain farmer or a cattle producer, you show me one producer who has ever sold an exported product through a multinational corporation and received a check for at least 1 cent for a piece of beef or a bushel of grain. I'd like to visit with them. Because once you sell your product, they don't come back and give me a return check and say, Mike, we exported 30 of your calves and here's your premium check. That doesn't happen. So I have yet to find anybody at a meeting that has ever received a penny for any piece of exported beef or exported grain. So with that, I'll be around here as we get through. Hopefully it'll work out. We got a good group. I think we've got a lot of new people coming on. We just need to get a few wins, you guys, and the politicians are being influenced by the money, the corporate money from the packers, and they have it and we don't, and we got to get that back. So thank you.
Thank you, Mike.
Thanks, Mike. I would like to just say that there's been a lot of talk so far this evening about the corporate people, the packers. The AMP Act is so important because all these people we're talking about, the packers, the corporate folks, the people that are putting it to the producers as well as the consumers, are the ones that have the lobbyists that go in and look at the laws. These people have been trying to pass laws since 2002 that I'm aware of to get things right in our industry. Okay, they go to committee, guess what? You have lobbyists, you have politicians. These people come together and say, well, we don't like this. Why do they not like this? Well, somebody above them told them to say, we don't like this. And that's why they don't like it. And then they're paying money to these politicians like, hey, you know, you need some money for your campaign. What can we do for you? But, you know, you got to do something for us too. So the AMP Act is all about taking a compilation of all these bills that have been, you know, put before Congress for 20 years, and grassroots producers and consumers, the people that buy our beef, have come together. They're looking at these bills, and we've taken them, we've copied and pasted some, and we've said, okay, we don't like this about the bill, because that takes away the competitive market. That takes away the level playing field. Let's put something in this bill that makes it fair for everybody. And that's what we did in the AMP Act. And the only way we're going to make this work is to get the consuming public, our customers, the beef consumer, to get behind this bill by the thousands. And when we introduce this bill in January, we need this to be a kitchen table topic. People who buy beef need to say to their congressmen and their senators, we want the AMP Act the way it is. We don't want it jacked with by politicians. We don't want it jacked with by lobbyists or the corporate giants. We want it the way it is. We want a level playing field. We don't want to take a whole bunch of money away from the corporate giants, but we want to take enough back so that the beef producers, the cattle producers can make a living and stay in business. So the AMP Act is very important, and we need folks to get behind it, and we need to share it with everybody. And the more people we get, we need thousands. That's the only way it's going to work. So with that, I think we have John Boy up next to talk about production time for cows and calves.
All right, I'm John Boy. I'm from Central Oklahoma. I'm a cow calf producer. I've been involved with cattle for a little over 40 years myself. Raised cattle in Kansas, Oklahoma, Arkansas, and Texas. Most of those places I work for people. But we got the different segments of the cattle production. We got the cow calf guy, we got backgrounders, we got feeders, and then we've got the packing plants that process it. But the cow calf guy will have that calf usually about the longest period of time frame there is. And he is the guy that's kind of taking the blunt of this, that is getting harmed the most as far as I'm concerned. But if he keeps a heifer back and he's going to have that heifer for somewhere around 3 years before he can ever get a penny out of it, out of a calf production, because you're going to have to grow that calf for a year, breed it for a year, and then a year before it's ready, kind of a rule of thumb. So, and then we got backgrounders that have the calf. They can usually turn them calves and have a couple a year. Your feeders, they can run and change them calves over about 3, sometimes 4 times a year. So for what a cow calf guy's doing 1 a year, your feedlots can do, a lot more. And then your packers usually have them critters for just weeks at a time. So, and they're the ones that's really making a killing off of the cattle right now. That's kind of what they wanted to touch on. We're running a little bit long on time, so I'm gonna kind of cut it back. But we're losing cow calf producers big time. This drought, and this year and this heat and stuff, it's even more so. I've got several neighbors that have got out and are not getting back in it. Like Bill Bullard said, somewhere around 15,000 a year, farmers and ranchers leaving the business. And I hate to see what's going to be this year with everything going on. I'm going to end it there and turn it over to you.
Thank you, John Boy. Has Lance joined us?
No.
Okay. So Shad, you're up next. Don't forget to unmute.
Can you hear me now?
There you go.
Sorry about that. Well, my name is Shad Sullivan, and I'm just an American cattle rancher. That's it, and that's all. I am more of a stalker guy, and we have operations in North Texas, Southeast Colorado, and we do run a few cows. So I sit on the board of directors at RCAF USA, and am happy to do that. And I'd just like to, thank these people that have worked so hard on this AMP Act, something that has really taken a lot of dedication. And I know we're all not only dedicated to preserving our operations, but fighting for them as well. Bill and everybody who has preceded me has done a fantastic job in saying what needs to be said. I'm the guy that when I talk about these issues, I go back to liberty and freedom, and I tie all of this back to freedom in production and freedom of choice. And my main fight is mandatory country of origin labeling. I believe that it is a liberty issue, and I believe that we must re-implement MCOOL in order to be fair to those people who have uplifted our operations and bought our product over the years. I believe that it provides freedom and choice to our consumer. And I don't really care if you're a consumer or a producer, you're on one end or the other. What we're all wanting to do is uplift and uphold the American system and the American values. I don't see anything wrong with seeking for America to be first in this system. And so there are so many things that are corrupt. There's so many things that are fork-tongued. And I think this AMP Act will start us down a road to where we can correct some of this stuff. RCAF USA assuredly has been working hard and doesn't really get enough credit for what they have done and what their belief system is, and that is to uplift our producers and our consumers. We have the greatest product in the world, and that needs to go be elevated. So with that, I think Brett and everybody's done a great job. I'm going to let it go there. Thank you, guys.
Thank you, Shad. Okay, our last speaker tonight and educator is Vaughn Meyer. Vaughn, you may be muted.
Can you hear me?
There we go. Yep.
You can hear me now?
We could. Now we can't.
How's that?
There you go.
Okay, we'll try that. Well, I'm Vaughn Meyer from Northwest South Dakota cow-calf producer, third, fourth generation, I guess. We've got the fifth generation here on the ranch with us too. And basically just trying to make a living for my family, my grandkids down the road, and help to feed this nation, which is probably the most important thing we can do in this country. And so I'm going to visit a little with you tonight about what made agriculture the envy of the world, American agriculture in particular. It was the freedom to choose and the thousands of immigrants who fled the tyranny and oppression of the European dictatorships throughout the past centuries. Immigrants of various cultural heritage who discovered North America's greatest wealth of rich and fertile soils. Abundant, productive resources, which when managed with individual visions of success, became the pillar of strength for our new fledgling nation. Agriculture is often overlooked industry by American consumers due to only 1% of our population participating in its actual production. With our vast, rich agricultural lands, Americans have almost always, and then I bumped it here, sorry about that. Americans have almost always experienced an abundant food supply. Additionally, however, consumers have often unknowingly experienced many of the economic forces of the beef industry. Agriculture's food and related industries contribute over 1.1 trillion to the U.S. gross domestic product in 2019. The output of American farms contributed 136 billion to this sum. Agriculture's added value to our national economy is known as the multiplier effect. The recent USDA statistics project that project that the value to be about 11 times. In other words, each dollar of agriculture created wealth contributes $11 towards our national GDP. With over 70% of agricultural lands being non-cultivatable and suited for grazing, beef and dairy cattle production have become the most important agriculture industry in the United States, consistently accounting for the largest share of the total cash receipts of agriculture commodities. Using the USDA figures, cattle production contributed 66.5 billion cash receipts to agriculture in 2021, or with a multiplier effect of 11, that contribution to our US GDP would likely be $731 billion. That's a huge amount given. However, throughout history, cattle producers have been at the mercy of the packing processing industries who collude to steal our profits. Back in the early 1900s, 5 packers controlled nearly 55% of the market and the processing and the packing industry. These packers basically controlled the shipping, the refrigeration, and the marketing. along with the processing, and had a pretty tight grip on the industry. With the advent of World War I, President Wilson realized that there was a problem there, because not only were they holding the American families that were at home here supporting the war effort, they were also holding the military captive and holding them at ransom, I guess is what you would say on the deal. So he, in 1920, he started threatening them a little bit, and that's brought about the 1920 consent decree, where the packers voluntarily agreed to divest themselves of the shipping and the refrigeration parts of, and the sale barns and that the big district yards and stuff like that they wanted to get rid of. And then about a year later, it was followed up by our Congress, which passed the 1921 Packers and Stockyards Act. And after that, our market started becoming cyclical in nature, with 7 to 9 years up to 12 years, with cycles of inventory reduced, inventory induced cycles is what they were. In 1981, everything kind of came to a stop when the consent decree was abolished by the Reagan administration, and it paved the way for corporate grade. Only this time, we had 4 major packers controlling nearly 86% of the market, and that still is about that figure today in there. In 2002, we reacted, thanks to many amongst us, and fought for country of origin labeling, which will pave the way for consumer choices for wholesome U.S. beef. Country of origin labeling, when enforced from 2012 to 2015, saw record profits for cattlemen due to the elimination of the largest packer captive supply tool, which was the imported beef and beef products, cattle and beef products. In 2015, however, Congress revoked the tool under the tariff retaliation threats, which were invoked by WTO. What happened? Markets immediately plummeted 45%, 20 billion loss annually to our cattle industry versus the 1.7 billion tariff threat. And they caved right in and said, that looks like a better choice to throw away those producers' money out there rather than put some tariffs on some of the wine industry and other industries. Also, using that multiplier effect of 11, that 220 billion a year loss, or in the 7 years of post-cool repeal, it's amounted to about $1.5 trillion in loss on there. What also has happened since then? Well, we've managed to lose about 43% of our U.S. beef cattle in operations. We've reduced the number of feedlots by 75%. We've reduced our cow herd, national cow herd, by 3.4 million head. Returns to cattle feeders have been a $25 per head per month loss for the past 2 decades. Returns to the cow-calf producers have declined $238 per bred cow since 1996. The producer's share of the consumer beef dollar declined 41% since 1980. 48 U.S. beef packing plants have gone out of business and closed their doors, leaving these 4 major plants. About 24% of the bonded markets in our industry, that's your local sale barns and that, have disappeared. And one other thing I would add to that, we've even seen empty shelves since then due to the COVID and other packer collusions in the last few years. Something we never thought we'd see in the United States on their deal. I'd like to use a quote that Bill Bullard passed out a long time ago, the first speaker here tonight, and I think it's very adequate. And he says, considering the 45% losses due to the 2015 elimination of country of origin labeling, minus the 17% recent fall 2021 market advancement, agriculture's GDP contribution should have been 936 billion, or nearly 1/16 of our current national debt. If you stop and think about that, cattle production could pay off our national debt in 16 years. If you took that figure right today and put it times our 338 million people in the United States, that'd be a figure of about $2,800 annually per every man, woman, and child in the United States. That's a huge contribution there that's being overlooked, or actually it's being controlled by four major packers in this country, of which two of them are international packers that don't even have ties to this country. Folks, agriculture begins in rural America, and small town America is drying up. In 2020, cow-calf returns per cow were near a minus $800 per head, times the local multiplier effect of 2. That would be for your first group in local towns. That's about $1,600 of income lost for a local small town per cow. If the average U.S. producer has 44 head of cows, or that would be a loss of Main Street revenue of about $70,400 per producer, each cattle producer, and that'd be within their geographic area out there. That's no wonder that our small towns are drying up. You know, you look around at where'd the hardware stores go, the implement dealers, the clothing stores, the barbershops, the banks, and so on are all leaving. If you don't have a post office or some sort of a government office in town, or maybe even medical facilities like that, your town is pretty bleak anymore. It's dependent on just those three major issues there. How do cattle affect the rest of agriculture? Well, 1/3 of our nation's corn crop nearly is always consumed by beef cattle in general. All of the cash hay crop is consumed by either cattle or sheep. And each ton of distiller grain produces 378 gallons of ethanol. The distiller grain market, in other words, is helping to subsidize the fuel prices at the pump. And, you know, if you divide that by a 10% or a 15% ethanol blend, you can take and figure that out at just about how much we are supporting today, the ethanol market in there, which helps every American consumer out there. A lot of them are using that now. Cattle industry benefits consumers. Additionally, the carbon footprint is finally starting to come to true life. We're at the mercy of the green people pointing bad fingers at us and that. But the last thing I saw on the carbon footprint is about 1.9%. That's a lot less than that 16% they were trying to stick us with early on. And look at the cattle industry's lunchbox. It's the world's largest carbon sink. Without that out there, we'd be at a very alarming deal. So I think we need to support this AMP Act. It's a comprehensive bill to rebuild rural America and our national food security. It's also a comprehensive bill that will probably help rebuild America from the economic end of our spectrum, with decreasing our national debt if we decide to ever quit printing money and move on. It's the four things in the AMP Act that we need immediately. We need the immediate reestablishment of country of origin labeling. We need the immediate establishment of mandatory levels of cash market packer participation. We need the expansion of independent processing infrastructure. We need the creation by USDA of oversight and enforcement authority to protect the individual rights of participation. In other words, we need them to strengthen or adopt and strengthen the GIPSA rules on that thing. Some of the other things I looked up here not too long ago for consumers out there, you know, that besides being a nutritious iron and niacin source for consumer consumption on there, nearly everything we touch in a day has some form of cattle products in it, whether it's nutrition, pharmaceuticals, cosmetics, soaps, detergents, plastics, paints, and so on, all the way down. Everything that we touch, whether we eat it or drive it or just plain live in it, it has something to do with the cattle industry. So a viable cattle industry is good for a viable nation, and we seem to be headed down a path that's going to put the cattle industry similar to what we've already seen in the hog and the sheep industry, which is totally vertically integrated. With that, that's all I have. I have to answer any questions if anybody has any.
Thanks, Vaughn. Hey, I forgot Joshua. So I'm going to ask Joshua to follow you, and then we'll take questions.
Okay.
So I'm Joshua Knope. I am a cow-calf producer. I've been in Western Oklahoma is where I'm based out of. And I've been in the cattle industry for 20 years now. I'm fifth generation in agriculture and grew up in this industry. And that's part of the reason that I'm fighting for it is I grew up in it. I want my kids to grow up in it. I'd like my grandkids to grow up in it whenever they come along. And I want other people to be able to get into the industry, and to have access to it and start cattle operations if they want to. And so that's part of the reason that I'm fighting for it. But I want to talk a little bit about the representation of the cattle industry, representation of producers, and specifically the representation that's in Washington, D.C. We've got 5 major groups that represent us, and those are RCAP USA, the U.S. Cattlemen's Association, National Cattlemen's Beef Association, and American Farm Bureau. And then, then the Farmers Union. So those are going to be the organizations that represent us in Washington. They're the ones that are lobbying for industry issues, industry bills and legislation that goes into our industry. The problem that we have is the biggest one of those is the National Cattlemen's Beef Association. And they represent both the cattle producer as well as the meat packing industry. They join together and they represent 2 sides of an industry that are competing against each other. It would be like an association that represents both the car manufacturer and the car parts manufacturer at the same time. And whenever they do that, they clearly lobby for the people that give them the most dues. The way that their dues set up is that they take $1 in dues per head of cattle that you own. And so if you're a feedlot that runs 50,000 head of cattle, then your dues are going to be 50,000 head times however many times you turn those cattle over within a year. If you're a meat packing and packer, it's going to be the same way. However many cattle you produce in that year, you pay dues to them. So the representation is off with that particular organization, and they've gotten into bed with other organizations like the World Wildlife Fund. And if anybody has ever looked into the World Wildlife Fund, they are big in a very big environmental organization, and that's what they focus on. And they've brought about policies within our industry that are harmful for us. They limit the competition within the industry. They limit the abilities for us to freely produce our product, and very harmful to small cow-calf producers like myself. And they've helped lead to this. But I say all that to let you guys know that TAPPPS is a 100% producer organization. We don't have a due structure. We are coming together on our voluntary time to do this. The same with RCAP USA. They are a 100% cattle producer organization. They also have consumers. You have the option to become a member of RCAP and help fight for this industry. So, and with that, I'll turn it back over.
Thank you, Joshua. We're going to go ahead and open it up for questions. Remember that you might be muted. So if you have a question. Okay, Chuck, are you still on?
Yeah, I'm here. We didn't get into vertical integration very much. I think Josh could talk a little bit about that. But before we go there, it's very important that the consumer understand I know a lot of this sounds complicated. Some of these things we went over tonight, even some of the beef and cattle producers are not really fully aware of, but there's so much that is so complicated, but yet it's so simple. The simplicity exists in the fact that the experts that have been talking tonight and others have actually taken the complicated part and taken a year to actually write legislation that's going to correct these problems. That's the complicated part, and we put it there. The simplicity of it is that we have, in essence, some corrupt politicians, some politicians that are being paid by others to look the other way. We have corporate people that are paying money to get what they want, to squeeze us out, and that goes back to vertical integration, and basically what vertical integration is, and it's happened in the chicken and the hog industry, is it is where you get to a point where the company, let's take Tyson, they did this to chickens. They got to a point where they produced the egg, let's say from conception to consumption. They produced the egg, they produced they provided the packing facilities, they provided the grain for the farmers. The farmers became essentially a slave, a serf, and they pretty much paid them what they wanted to. And that's what's happening to the cattle industry. So what we have to do is to make that change before we get there. We have to get behind this legislation, and it's going to take a lot of folks to do it. We've got to let our congressmen and our senators know that we do not want legislation that is changed by lobbyists, or because the grassroots people wrote this legislation. And that's what it's going to take, is for everybody to get behind it and make the changes we need to put the packers in their place, let them make their money, let us make our money, and create a level playing field in a competitive market again. So who else do we have? There's questions now? Anybody have any questions? Any final comments from anyone?
Chuck, I'll just say, I'd like to remind everyone who's new to the call tonight to share with your friends. If you found any value at all in what you learned tonight, we'll have a link up with the recording that you can share. So you don't have to try to tell everyone. It'll be posted on the TAPPPS group, or you can email tappsgroup@gmail.com and I'll send you a link.
Well, thank you, everybody, for attending tonight, and we really appreciate our contributors. Definitely experts in the field. These people know what they're talking about, and we certainly appreciate everybody being here tonight and everybody who joined us. And with that, I hope everybody has a great evening.
Good night, everyone.
Thank
Good
you.
night.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good night.